Alright, hello everyone. So today is going to be a really interesting day. This is one of my favorite topics to teach, and it's because it's all about consciousness. So it's going to be a nice continuation from what we just talked about in terms of sensation and perception, because the aspect of consciousness that we're focusing on today is going to be attention and awareness and that side of things. So it's a pretty nice continuation. This is also another one of those chapters that you're going to notice the topics hop around fairly grammatically. And to be truthful, the second half of the chapter today is something that I always forget to teach, which I find almost ironic that I always forget this section on awareness. But this is the first year I have remembered it in time, so we're going to do it early so I don't forget it. But yeah, so you're going to find that this chapter is sort of a weird conglomeration of attention and focus, consciousness in general, and then we're going to delve into sleep and hypnosis and other weird aspects of consciousness. So it's a very amalgamated grouping of random topics that are kind of vaguely related to one another. So just expect that with our topics, because we will hop around quite a bit. Just don't be put off by it. So we can start off as per usual with our definition. What is consciousness? And you're going to find that a lot of our definitions in this chapter are almost circular definitions. So we'll talk about consciousness as the awareness of internal and external stimuli. But when we talk about awareness, we might talk about things that we are conscious of. And so you'll find that a lot of these definitions tend not to give you a whole lot of, I guess, concrete answers in terms of what it is that we're looking at. And this is rather intentional. It is a vague topic. And in a lot of cases, when we're doing research on consciousness, we rely very heavily on those operational definitions of what aspects we care about, simply because it is such a broad and amorphous grouping. So when we're talking about consciousness, we might also call it our subjective awareness of ourselves and our environment. So this is us being aware or conscious of things that are going on inside and outside of our own bodies. So we might be aware that we are hungry or tired. That would be internal awareness. Or we might be aware that the room is just a little bit too cold. That would be something external. So we can have different levels of awareness based on what we're surrounded by and what's going on within us. And since that hasn't done a whole heck of a lot to clear up what we're talking about with consciousness, we can talk about what consciousness incorporates. So what are some other qualities of consciousness? We care that consciousness is something that is subjective and private. So it's something that we know about our own consciousness, but it's very difficult for someone else to have a grasp of our own reality. So you might have heard people talk about, how do I know that everyone sees blue the same way? Well, we can't. There's no way to quantify that. It is subjective and it is private. This also goes along with the idea of maybe somebody's cold and you can't necessarily tell just by looking at them. Or maybe somebody's thinking about something in particular and you can't necessarily know the exact ins and outs of their thoughts. We, as researchers, want to get at some of those specifics. We might like to know how people think about things, but it's really difficult to do that because they're internal and not directly measurable. Our consciousness is also dynamic, so we are constantly changing. Sometimes we're focused on one thing, sometimes on another. Maybe we're more alert some days and not other days. Or maybe something has happened and somebody's walking by the classroom and they're really loud and that's grabbed your attention. So your consciousness is always changing. And it's self-reflective, so our mind is aware of its own consciousness. So we can have these very meta discussions of being aware of our awareness of ourselves. And so it can go on and on like that. So okay, those are some of the qualities of consciousness, and I don't know if we've cleared it up any, but what we can do is start talking about how we might test for consciousness. How do we start testing for this awareness? And I've already kind of hinted at some of the difficulties of testing for consciousness, and it's because it's something internal and therefore unknowable. It's something that's constantly changing, and it's something that you can be self-aware of. So it's kind of like trying to hit a moving target, but not being able to see the target clearly at all. So when we talk about our different types of testing, we're going to talk about sort of pros and cons, and some of them might be good for testing for certain aspects of consciousness and really bad at testing for others. So the first of these are self-reports, and this is kind of a broad category, basically where we ask people to describe their own inner experiences. So this could be an interview or a survey. Ask a series of questions and get maybe a verbal or a written response. It could be like what's in the image there. They have a Likert scale, and they ask, okay, based on this statement, how strongly do you agree or disagree that this applies to you? And so this can be really good because it gives us that direct insight into their subjective experiences. So even though it's something internal and we can't necessarily know about it, they can tell us what they know. They can tell us what they're thinking about and how they're thinking about it. Of course, the downside here being that we can't verify that. We don't know for sure that that's what's going on. So they can give us all of this information, but we have to be aware that there could be some deception. They could lie about what they're thinking about or how they're thinking about it. So we can't be sure of its validity. So, okay, maybe we decide we want to just get a physiological study. So we've already kind of talked about these previously, but this would just be some kind of biological measurement. So we would like to link our biological processes to the mental ones that are going on. So when we're exposed to a certain kind of stimulus, does our heart rate change? Or do our brain waves respond differently? Or does a particular part of our brain light up? So we can connect things that we are exposed to and try and make some assumptions about what we're thinking and how we're thinking based on our physiological responses. So this gives us some objective measures. It's very hard to lie on these. You can't completely change the way that your brain responds to stimuli. So we get some kind of objective measurement, but we don't have a way to connect that to the subjective, that internalized evaluation of the situation that we got from our earlier type of responding, those self-reports there. So we can get exactly what the body is doing, but it's a lot harder to connect it to what exactly is going on. And maybe we can do some self-reports and some physiological studies, but as soon as you introduce self-reports, we have that issue of we're not sure that they're telling the truth. Maybe they don't understand the question that's being formed. Maybe it's not a full experience. All of those potential issues. So a couple of drawbacks, but it depends on what we're looking for. Sometimes you just care about what part of the brain lights up, and that's enough for you. And the last type of test for consciousness are behavioral studies. And these are kind of an interesting class. So usually when we talk about behavioral studies, we're talking about asking questions in a way that doesn't necessarily involve language. So we can have behavioral studies for humans, but a lot of times you're going to see these kinds of studies in non-human animals. I guess also you could have a lot of behavioral studies for children because when they're younger, they don't have a way to explain or express exactly what's going on. And that's a good way of thinking of these behavioral studies, where we're looking at a behavioral response, how do they act or behave in a particular situation, given the knowledge that they should have. So we have to make some assumptions about how they might act if they have different kinds of information, and then see if they act on that information or not. And that sounds a little bit vague, so let's go through an example. One of the most famous behavioral studies in terms of testing consciousness is the Rouge test. And this one was really important and still is really important under the concept of theory of mind. So if you haven't heard of this before, it's sort of a debate about awareness of you being a self that is separate from others and that others are their own unique selves as well. This was originally something that was thought to be exclusive to humans, but there's some more evidence recently where theory of mind might also apply in some level to non-human animals. It is a large point of contention in the field, is what we can say. So people can get very worked up about it, but they might test these things like a sense of self or an awareness of self by using this Rouge test. And so the image at the bottom there is a chimpanzee, and it's very hard to tell, but he has a red spot on his eyebrow. And so it used to be that they would use actual rouge, so blush, and they would put this animal in front of a mirror, and they would see if they recognized the image in the mirror was actually themselves, and that the red on the mirror's forehead was actually on their own forehead. So in this situation, the chimpanzee has reached up to brush the red off their face. So that would be passing this test, saying that they've recognized that the reflection is actually themselves, and so they see that there's something weird on the reflection, they're going to touch it on their own face. So I use the example of maybe you have a dog or a cat at home, and if you have a mirror that touches the floor, they might be cautious around that mirror because they assume it's another dog or cat. So that would be not recognizing themselves. But, so chimpanzees have passed this, elephants have passed this, I believe dolphins as well. Ravens and other corvids can do this, though there's some debate on that for the setup of it. And I believe there's even some fish that have been able to do this. So it was something that was originally thought exclusive to humans, and now they're having to sort of reevaluate that. But again, a very cutting edge part of the field where they've tried to use this sort of assumption of what they would or would not know to determine if they have a sense of self or an awareness that the thing in the mirror is themselves. So there's lots of different ways as a behavioral psychologist that you can set up questions like this, where if they behave in one particular way, it says that they have this kind of knowledge, and if they behave in another particular way, they have a different kind of knowledge. So you can get reports on what they understand, how they've stored or are using knowledge based on their responses to very controlled situations. All right, so those are a bunch of different broad categories of tests. Obviously, every time somebody is trying to do any kind of research on consciousness, we can have a lot of variety in how you would approach these. So it depends on which aspect of consciousness you're looking at. So you're going to prioritize different kinds of tests and different kinds of studies based on what you're looking for. But that gives you a general feeler for what's done in the field. The next couple of slides, I just want to retouch on something that we talked about earlier on in the course. And these were a couple of perspectives on how the mind might be involved in our behavior. So you might remember our psychodynamic perspective and our cognitive perspective when we were talking about things like structuralism versus functionalism and monism versus dualism. So same basic breadth. We were talking about how different concepts were framed and how we would think about different aspects. So we're going to look at the two who were very focused on the role of the mind or on conscious thought in our behavior. So we'll mention the behaviorists as people who were very opposed to this. If you remember, our behaviorists were all focused on our interactions with the environment and that behavior was externally driven. So they would clearly be really against the concept of cognition and consciousness. But we're going to focus in on the two big ones. So starting with psychodynamic perspective, we can talk about that view first. And as per always, anytime you see psychodynamic or psychoanalytic, you should immediately think of Freud. So he was the one who founded this field and was responsible for the early psychodynamic view. We are going to talk about how it has changed and evolved over time. But the very basics here are that there are three different levels of consciousness, three different levels of awareness, and we can have sort of a hard line between each of them. So our consciousness are the mental events that we are currently actively aware of. So if you're listening to the lecture, then your consciousness includes the topics that we're discussing. For preconscious, those are events that are outside of our current awareness, but that you can easily recall. So when I mentioned that our behaviorists were focused on environmental influences on behavior, you were able to hopefully recall that information and incorporate it into the stuff that we were talking about at the time. So something can move from our preconscious to our conscious very easily as you're prompted to bring it in. Or maybe you're prompting yourself to bring it in. Maybe you're trying to remember some of the other kinds of perspectives that we talked about at the time to see if you can make extra connections. So that's the conscious and the preconscious. The one that the psychodynamic view is especially known for is the unconscious. And these are things that are not brought into our conscious awareness, things that we're usually not aware of at all. And of course, in true Freud fashion, these would be things that we tend to repress or actively try and avoid. So Freud was really focused in on things like aggression and sexual desire and things like that. So the unconscious was full of this sort of boiling thing that you wanted to act on but weren't aware of, and so it would boil over into your behavior. And so, of course, there's some contention over the entire role of the unconscious and how much of it was explicitly driven by sexual desire and aggression. So we'll revisit the more moderate view of that we use nowadays. But as another way that you can kind of envision this concept or this breakup between these three different sections, most textbooks use an image of an iceberg. And if you think of the peak of the iceberg, the part that's outside of the water is our conscious. It's in the light, it's exposed, it's stuff that we have access to right now. And then right at the waterline, just below the surface, we would have our preconscious, the events that aren't currently exposed to the air, but could very easily be exposed with just a little bit of movement. And then the unconscious is everything that's deep, the deepest part of the iceberg, the stuff that never sees the light of day, the stuff that is hidden away in our unconscious. So that kind of envisioning might help. All right, so obviously we have some criticisms. I mentioned already that our behaviorists really dislike the idea of the mind and mentality and consciousness, and they especially hate the idea of the unconscious. So if they don't like the idea of conscious thought influencing behavior, unconscious thought influencing behavior was way worse for them. So they disliked this whole view on principle because there was no room for environmental influences in this psychodynamic perspective. It was all about things that we are either actively aware of or not aware of, and that was it. Our cognitive and the more modern psychodynamic psychologists have issues with different aspects. They don't necessarily disagree with the conscious versus unconscious, things that we're aware of versus unaware of. That part's fine. They mostly hated the focus on unconscious sexual and aggressive urges, as we might expect, where they'd focus on other aspects of behavior, other things that could be motivating us and driving our behavior. So even modern psychodynamic perspective, they still have that idea of the unconscious, and they might even ask about your childhood in order to understand sort of how you grew as a person, but they're not going to focus in on repressed memories and sexual urges and aggressive things that have happened to you in the past, like Freudian psychodynamic perspectives might have. So we've come quite a long way in terms of psychodynamic views, and so it does still exist, but isn't as extreme. And then, of course, we can come into our cognitive point of view. So this was in stark contrast to the psychodynamic. So instead of that whole focus on things that we're unconscious of and things that we're unaware of being strong driving forces in our behavior, they really showed unconscious and conscious as not so much opposing forces and things that are entirely different in nature, but things that were complementary, things that worked together to allow us to function fully. And so instead of calling it the conscious and the unconscious, they termed it controlled processing or automatic processing, We might also call the controlled processing effortful processing, which will kind of make sense because with controlled or effortful processing, it's something that you are intentionally doing, something that you are putting effort into, it's something that you are in control of. So it's a voluntary use of attention, it's something that we are trying to focus on. So maybe you're doing mental math and you're walking yourself through all of the steps to solve this math problem. That would be done using that controlled processing. And it's a good tactic because you have lots of flexibility. You can introduce new ideas. Maybe the way that you thought you solved the problem didn't work, so you need to try something else. So lots of flexibility, but because you have to sort of manually oversee every step of the process, it can be very slow. So it takes a lot of time and effort, but we have lots of flexibility. Our automatic processing, as you might anticipate, is something that happens automatically. It has minimal conscious processing, so it occurs very, very quickly with minimal oversight required. The downside is, because it's happening automatically, it can only occur for things that you know how to handle. So maybe you've solved the same kind of word problem 20 times already. So you just have the formula, you plug in the numbers, and off you go. No thought required. But then if you encounter a slight change, maybe they introduce a different magnitude of number or something that messes with your setup, you'd have to stop, because our automatic processing, while fast, is static. It only works for the stuff that it works for. As soon as you're faced with something that doesn't solve quickly, that doesn't follow your sort of base planning, then you're nudged out of that automatic processing and you have to go back to that controlled processing. A great example of this is if you drive or ride a bike or anything like that. So every day on your way to school, you take the same route. And someday you might even find yourself pulling into the parking lot going, wait a second, how did I get here? I drove from home to school, I followed all of the road signs, I obeyed the posted speed limits, I didn't run any lights, but I wasn't really aware of what was happening. I was going on autopilot. So it was fine, it was fast, it was static, I followed the route directly, and it freed my mind up to do other things, like maybe rehearse information for a test that's coming up or something like that. But if you're on that same route a little bit later, and there's an accident on the road, or there's construction, and they detour you, you have to turn down a different street and find an alternate path. Your automatic processing can't handle that because you've never taken that route before. So you have to stop relying on the automatic processing and you have to switch over to controlled or effortful processing to figure out, wait, where the heck am I? Where do I need to be? And how do I get there? So it's going to be a little bit slower and a little bit more resource intensive, but it allows us to be flexible to those sudden situations. Another great example of automatic processing and what happens when controlled processing kicks in is when you're walking up the stairs. If you don't think about putting one foot in front of the other, you are perfectly fine. You will usually make it up the stairs, no questions asked. As soon as you start thinking about the process of walking upstairs, your controlled processing kicks in and you're actually a lot more likely to trip and fall. So this is when it can be problematic to introduce that controlled processing because our muscle memory, that part of our automatic processing, would have been a lot more reliable and maybe a lot less dangerous. All right, and on that idea of sort of things that we are actively aware of and things that are running in the background gives us this awesome transition over to awareness and attention. And as promised, our circular definitions have not ended. So we can talk about awareness as our ability to directly know and perceive, to feel or be cognizant of events. So, okay, that sounds very much like we're being conscious of things, which, if we go to the Wikipedia definition, we have the state of being conscious of something. All right, that's not helpful, but all right. So awareness and consciousness are pretty close. Where we start to get actual useful information is when we bring in attention. And attention is sort of the focused version of our awareness, where we concentrate our awareness on some kind of stimulus and exclude the other stimuli that aren't relevant. So our attention is focused awareness or concentrated awareness, something that we have directed and focused on something that we've deemed important. And this can be a conscious deeming of importance. This could be an unconscious automatic process, but it's basically how we're going to divide up our limited mental resources. So we have to decide what we're going to focus on, what we're going to pay attention to, because we don't have the ability to focus on absolutely everything all the time. And so we're going to focus very briefly on divided attention, which can be really helpful if you want to do something like drive and listen to music. Those are using two different systems. You can use your ears to pick up on music, and you use the rest of your body to do the driving. Those don't interfere too much. But if we start having overlapping tasks, if we have tasks that are requiring similar parts of the brain, or even things that are just overly draining on general resources, we can start having problems. So if we want to look at things that require similar resources, maybe you're listening to lecture but also trying to read a text or an email. Because both involve the language part of your brain, you have to pick which one you focus on. So you'd have to direct your attention to one or the other. You can't really do both, at least not well. And then if we think of something like cell phone use while driving, if you're paying attention to something else, if you're focusing on something else, the biggest problem is that it reduces the resources you have available to you while driving. It's not necessarily as problematic when you're relying on that automatic processing. When you're driving down the highway, it might not matter that you've reached to turn up the music or something like that. But if something happens that is outside of your automatic processing, maybe a deer jumps out in the road, then that extra moment of divided attention can reduce your response time. And I do always talk just a little bit here about some of the really neat research that someone I had worked with at the University of Alberta did. So if you've ever heard of Anthony Singhal, he's done a lot of speaking about divided attention, specifically cell phones in cars. And I found it interesting because when I was younger, they were just having cell phones be a thing that people had, and so at first there were no laws against using your phone in the car. And then they pushed the big deal about having your wireless headsets, having some kind of Bluetooth headset so that you could talk on the phone while driving. And they found over time that talking on the phone, even if you're not physically holding the phone, is almost just as dangerous, just as attention-sucking as having the phone physically in your hand. So they thought that banning people from having their phones in their hand, talk to people hands-free, that would fix the problem. But in fact it didn't, and actually kind of ended up making it a little bit worse. So the reason for this is because a lot of what's going on with using cell phones and having a conversation with someone is the issue being that you're talking to someone who's outside of the vehicle. So if you're driving and have a passenger and a deer is approaching the road, your passenger might be really helpful. They might point it out. Or maybe they'll stop talking so that you can focus on something that's more important. They can react to what's actively happening in the vehicle. But someone on the phone doesn't have access to that information. They can't see what's going on, and they might keep talking. So it's more distracting to have someone who can't adjust their behavior according to what you're dealing with. So that's one of those interesting findings that they've really been showing lately, where it's a lot better to just wait and pull over to have the conversation, especially if you're driving somewhere that needs attention. This also kind of ties into the fact that sometimes when you get close to a location and you're really focusing on where you're going, you might turn the music down. And it seems ridiculous because listening to music shouldn't impact anything, but it allows you to focus that little bit better to have less distractions going on. So that could be, I need all the resources that I can get, so I'm going to stop using things even though they're just using other systems because I need what I can get. All right, so that was a little bit of a tangent, but that's all right. The next thing we can talk about is how we direct our attention. And you might have figured out that this can be either a conscious or unconscious process. We can choose to shift our attention to something. Maybe you've already known most of the information that we've talked about in the lecture, so you've chosen to go and answer some emails or something. And you'll come back to the lecture when new stuff comes up. So that was a conscious process. But there are also unconscious aspects. So some stimuli are so attention-grabbing that they will automatically draw your attention. Some things are so biologically relevant that we can't help but notice them. So if you think of sitting in class and maybe a fire alarm goes off, flashing lights, loud sirens, that sort of thing, that would be very attention-grabbing. It's supposed to be. So we might shift our focus to something like that, and it isn't something that we intend to do, it just happens because of some of the qualities of the stimuli that are involved. We're going to wrap up a couple of slides ahead when we start talking about different factors that make something attention-grabbing and what we focus in on. I did want to briefly talk about one way that we can actually test our attention and our ability to divide our attention. And this is a process called shadowing. So you could have, the easiest way to do this is to have somebody listen to sounds, one on either side. So have a headset. The right side is listing a bunch of different species of birds. The right side is doing a bunch of weather types. And so they get you to listen to those, and the test could be, okay, repeat the words that you hear on this side, and then after you've repeated for a while, they might ask, what were the words on the side that you weren't attending to, the side that you weren't repeating? And usually what we find is that people aren't able to recall the other message. Sometimes they aren't even able to tell you what general topic the message was on. So it might have taken all of their focus to repeat back one list, and they weren't even aware of the other. All right, so next I have a short video that does a really good job of illustrating attention. Okay, and so there's no sound for this, but there are words on the screen, so hopefully you can see that. So it's getting you to count how many passes the team in white make. Did most of you get in the right number range? Okay. Did anyone actually notice the bear?
I did, but I've seen this before. I need to look for it.
Yeah, I always try and mix it up. I have a couple of different ones that I use. Sometimes it's a gorilla, sometimes it's a bear. But this does a fantastic job of showing those limitations of our attention. So this one was actually a really effective campaign to make people be aware of their limitations of attention. So maybe if you're not looking for cyclists, you might not see them at all. So a good concept to be aware of. And we can call this concept inattention blindness or inattentional blindness, depending on the text. And this is the idea that you weren't blind actually to the bear. You didn't have the ability not to see it, but your attention, your focus was on something else. You were focusing so hard on something that was just challenging enough to hold all of your focus that you weren't able to register that there was that extra stimulus. So it's not that you didn't see that bear. Your nervous system was still capable of picking up on it. It still shone on the back of your retina, and those signals might even have been sent to the brain, but it was never entered into our consciousness. We were never actually aware of it, and so we never did anything with that information. So you've seen it, and this works for things that you've heard or felt or whatever, but you just don't know that you've seen it. So this is something that could absolutely be used by, say, people doing street magic, where they can force all of your focus to one place while they're doing something else that you are unaware of somewhere else. And there's lots and lots of really cool studies that they've done looking at this. So they've looked at radiologists looking at x-rays, and they would sort of superimpose images of animals onto the x-rays, and the radiologist would be so focused in on whatever they were looking at, whether it was a bone or sort of different densities of tissue, that they didn't realize that the overall image was an animal. They've also had issues where pilots can focus so intently on their instruments, especially during training, that they might fail to notice that there might be things like planes on a runway they're trying to land on. Luckily, this is something that they identified as a potential issue fairly early on, and it's one of those things that pilots get trained out of during simulations when they're getting started. It's kind of like when you start driving and there are so many different things to focus on that it's very easy to miss something like a cyclist or people in motorcycles, because it's a different size and shape and way of moving from what you're paying attention to. So lots of different ways that we can adjust our attention and be aware of this inattentional blindness. And then, as promised, we can wrap up with our factors that actually influence our attention. So obviously, the nature of the stimulus is definitely going to have an effect on whether we notice it or not, whether we pay attention or not. We are predisposed to pay attention to things that are new. And we've already kind of talked about this, especially with sensory adaptation. We pay a lot of attention to things that are different. We tend to ignore things that are the same or constant. So if there's a new poster or billboard put up in your neighborhood, the first day you might notice it and you might look at it and investigate what it's for. But by the time it's been there for a week or two, you don't really notice it at all. We also pay attention to things that move, things that have high intensity, whether they're very bright or very loud or very colorful or whatever. Things that are repetitive or in stark contrast to their surroundings. So things that stand out in the environment. So a lot of things in change or just drawing our attention. We can also have biological relevance and personal significance that kind of directs each of us to pay attention to different things. So we can look at things like our individual internal state. So if you're hungry and you walk past a Subway sub, and you smell bread because they pump that smell outside of the store. If you're really hungry, that makes it very, very appealing and you really notice it. But if you're just coming from lunch and you just ate a whole lot of food and you're not hungry at all, then that might not be appealing. You might not even notice it. If we're really tired, we tend to focus internally and ignore external cues because we're so focused on how tired we are. And we have very limited mental resources. Personal motivation and interest is another big one. So somebody who studies plants will focus on plants. Those of us who study birds tend to notice birds. Again, if it's auditory, so listening for bird songs, I'm really bad for that. Or seeing birds. Architects will study architecture. So there's different things that we kind of get predisposed to notice because it's part of either our job, part of our experience, or just something that we really like. And of course, personal experience, so previous things that you've been exposed to can affect how you react to things now. If you've been playing a video game for a really long time, you might pick up on weird little patterns that nobody else would notice. A great example of this is if you play the Pokemon games or even Super Mario. There are certain arrangements that make you think about hidden items or secret passages, and it would be really hard to put into words why you think that that particular spot has something about it, but it feels like it should. So that's your personal experience giving you an indicator, and other people might not notice that. I also like using the experience of individuals who like haunted houses. I shared an office with someone who absolutely loves scary things. She thinks they're hilarious. That's her favorite thing. I am so bad at that, and the more of them that I see, the more sensitized I get to it. So she has learned that I don't do scary things, and she absolutely does. So she might ignore something startling, whereas I would over-respond to it due to experience. Another bunch of things that we are predisposed to notice are things like attractive faces. So biologically, it makes sense to notice people who are attractive because it might be an indicator of a high quality mate. We're also really good at noticing angry or fearful faces and even sounds. And that makes sense too. Someone who's afraid is probably afraid of something, and maybe that something they're afraid of is something you should be worried about too. Someone angry might be a more direct threat, so you'd want to notice where they are. So we are hardwired to pay attention to those. It also kind of ties into that fact that we are predisposed to notice faces. So even faster responses when those faces are intense. We're also very good at focusing on moving stimuli, especially if it's on a path where it'll interact with you. The best example of this is the clip of George Bush ducking out of the way when someone threw a shoe at him. It's, if you've ever seen it, it's George Bush standing next to a guy at a podium, and someone stands up, throws a shoe, Bush ducks immediately, gets out of the way of the path of the shoe. The guy standing next to him almost doesn't react at first and then ducks comically late. And the reasoning for that is when that item is on a trajectory that will interact with you, our brain processes it quicker, and we have almost a reflexive response where we don't have that conscious awareness and processing. It's an automatic thing. So we duck out of the way a lot faster than we would if we were thinking about it consciously. So because Bush would have been hit, he ducks a lot faster. The guy standing next to him, who wasn't in the line of fire, reacted much slower because he was using a different pathway. It's one of those very beneficial things where I have a very slow reaction time when I'm thinking about things, but I played sports enough that I have sort of that automatic reflexive response to avoid getting hit, which is very beneficial when you are a pitcher in baseball. And then the last thing we can talk about ties into our vision again, where we had hinted at the fact that our peripheral, the things that we see with our rods off to the side, we're very selectively responsive to things that are relevant. So our vision is a lot more accurate and detailed when it's on our fovea. That focal point gets us detail and important extra information. But our periphery is very specialized to notice things that matter. So it's really good for identifying things that are natural. So the silhouette of an animal might draw our attention very quickly, but the silhouette of a chair might not be as attention-grabbing because we know it's inanimate. So it's really good to identify, say, predators sneaking up on us, or things in our environment that we might want to interact with. And we're really good at having this rapid shift from things that were in our periphery and focusing with our focal point to get all of the detail out of it. So we have a very, very quick response, especially for naturalistic stimuli, where if something moves in our periphery, we're going to focus in on it and make sure it's not a threat because we're not quite sure. And that's a pretty good spot to wrap up. We're a little bit early today, but that's everything I wanted to chat about here. We'll start hopping into our other topics for the rest of the week. We're probably not finishing this chapter until Monday. And as I said previously, we are going to hop topics a lot, so just be ready for that. But I will see you guys on Friday.